Hi, I'm Angela Walters, and welcome to the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along Dot to Dot Quilting. Are you ready to go dot to dot to dot in areas besides just your blocks? In this week's video, we're going to finish up the Free Motion Challenge by learning how to use the dot to dot technique in those irregularly shaped areas of your quilt, such as those areas in between blocks or repeating areas. There are a few things you can do to make it easier. The first and probably easiest way to deal with those differently shaped blocks is to just treat them as though they were a regularly shaped block. While quilting this quilt for my friend Heather, those curved areas really threw me for a loop as to what to do. But then I realized that dot to dot would be a great design to really pull the eye to the center. I just treated it like a triangle, picking a home base and quilting those wedges to fill in the area. Now this adorable quilt, pieced by Emily Sierra of Carolina Patchworks, in the elongated hexagon I did the same thing, just treating it as though it were a regular hexagon or a square, filling that space in as completely as possible. Or how about this quilt by Julie Herman? Instead of quilting all the individual pieces of the star block differently, I treated the center hexagon and the outer pieces as one whole block. Picking the center as the home base really draws the eye to the center of that block, making it shine. Combining the designs is not only a great way to fill in those irregular spaces, it also can result in some really fun variations by using the diagonal lines to define areas and then the wedges to fill in everything else. Just like it did when I used them in Tula Pink's Sea Monster quilt to create a fun, spiky look to her adorable block. I quilted a diagonal line touching one point to just inside the next point, but then I stopped, created a wedge shape, which I echoed, and then continued on to the other side. Simple, yet so impactful. This is another great example of using dot to dot quilting to fill in irregular shapes. In two of the sides, I picked a home base and quilted wedges that filled in that area. While they're not exactly triangles, those wedge shapes really fill in that whole area and bring your eye to the center. In two of the blocks, I used the quilting to break it up into a different shape and then filled it in. So here's my diagonal lines, and then in the space left over on each side, adding a wedge. And you can also see I did a little bit of dot to dot quilting in between the blocks. Just another way to add a bit of fun to the quilt. This 9-patch block, I wanted to use the quilting to really draw the eye to this area. I extended the lines out to here to create a triangle, which I filled in, and then added more wedges on the other side. It's the same exact thing I did on the last block, just a lot more dramatic. One way to use the dot to dot quilting in differently shaped blocks is to use the quilting to create the shape you want to quilt. In this example, I used the quilting to create the triangle and then quilted the diamond design inside. Adding more lines is an easy way to fill in any irregular spaces that might be left over. You can make this technique work for any sizes. So this is a smaller area, a little bit bigger, and then even bigger still. Here's another block that's a great example of using wedges to fill in those irregularly shaped blocks. Picking a home base, quilting a line to the opposite edge, echoing the sides, and returning back. I'm going to do the same on both sides so that I end up with a symmetrical design. Let's look at this O block. Made out of trapezoid-like shapes. They're not exactly square, they're not exactly rectangle, but they're easy to quilt by using the quilting to create that triangle and then filling it in. I love how the dot to dot design has such a nice contrast with the swirl filler in the background. Another example is in star blocks. Breaking up the stars into different shapes like triangles and diamond designs really allowed me to create an interesting looking design without marking. Sometimes the irregular areas that you're filling in aren't just blocks. It could be the space between blocks or a longer repeating irregular shape. This Peaks and Valleys quilt is the perfect definition of an irregularly spaced area. I have a few tips to help you when trying to quilt dot to dot designs in a space like this. If you happen to be quilting along with me on the challenge quilt, you have the perfect example, the chevrons in the middle. First step, decide if you can break it into basic shapes. We could pretend that this chevron is broken into triangles. So here I have one triangle, the next going the opposite direction. Other ways you can break up that chevron. I can look at this area right here as my repeating shape. Or this could be my repeating shape. But before I start quilting, I need to think about how I'm going to transition from one shape to the next. It could be part of the design. Perhaps the design starts at one point and ends at the other. I can use a line of quilting to get me to the next design, or I can use traveling along the edge to get me to that design. Once I have those things figured out, then I can start experimenting with different ways to fill it in. And there are so many ways you can do this. In this first row, I'm going to pretend that the repeating shape is a triangle. So I can start by quilting a line that goes to my point, quilt the wedges that fill in that triangle shape, and then continue the line on to the other side so I can repeat it in the opposite direction. Quilting my wedges in those triangles, and then continuing on to the next one. And you can see how the design is really starting to come together and filling in that shape. Now let's try a different design. Instead of using wedges, let's do the diamond design. I'm still going to use my line to transition to my next point, still fill in that triangle, and still move on. So I've created my shape, I've filled it in, and now I'm going to move on to the next one. And that's going to give me a slightly different effect, but still look really neat. I've been using the quilting to transition to my next point. If I wanted to pick a different transition, for instance, quilting along the seam, I could change up the design in the triangle. All my lines will come to this point. It's going to give me just a slightly different effect using those wedges. So in this example, I'm breaking up that chevron into the same exact shape, a triangle, but I'm picking different designs to fill it in and different ways of transitioning in between the two. Now let's see what happens when we break up our chevron into arrow shapes. These lines can be marked, they can be just implied, or they can be quilted depending on the design that I pick out. But once I have my shape, then I can decide how I'm going to transition to the next one. So I think I'm going to use traveling to get to my next point, and I think I'll do the wedges again, except this will be my home base so that all my wedges come back to this point. So traveling along the side and then filling in that whole arrow shape with wedges. Once that space is filled in, I can travel along the seam to my next point and do the same thing. On this particular section, I haven't marked my boundary, but I can visualize where it is, and I know that I just don't want to go past this point. Of course, if it helps you, you can mark a line right there to help keep you on track. And there we have the really neat wedges that fill in that arrow shape. But let's see a transition where we use the quilting to end up where we want to go. That means I'm going to pick a design that will start here and end on the opposite side. I think I'm going to do a couple diamond designs with a line in the middle to pull it all together. And then I'm going to quilt a line straight across to the other side so that I can repeat. And there's the first part, and I'm going to do the second part, ending at the opposite side. It's amazing how the same technique can give you two completely different looks just depending on how you work the design. For the last part of my chevron, I'm going to combine the straight lines and the wedges. I'm still going to do my diagonal line across, then I'll fill in the space with a little wedge, and then continue on to the other side, adding a little wedge within that area. So I probably would add another echo line in there and maybe a little bit of traveling to really fill in that space. Now let's see what happens when we break them up into smaller V's. I'm going to pretend that the shape that I'm filling in makes this alternating V. I've used the quilting to define my space, and now I can add another echo line inside. And if you don't end up exactly where you need to be, a little traveling along the seam will take care of that. And now I can quilt along to the other side, create my same shape in the opposite direction, and fill it in as well. Depending on how much room you have in your space, you could add more or less echo lines to really fill it in. Now instead of doing the diamond design, I'm going to quilt wedges. Then I'll use my quilting as my transition to the next shape. Your quilting doesn't have to be as intricate as mine. Quilting just a diagonal line that goes from point to point to point is still going to create an interesting effect in those chevrons. Another option is you can quilt one side of your chevron and then come back and quilt the other. This can be especially helpful if you're working on a larger chevron because it'll help break down that space and make it a little easier to manage. And then come back and do the same on the other side. And as simple as it is to quilt it this way, the result is really fun. I'm actually getting a different chevron shape inside the chevron. Now I could stop here, I could add an echo line or some fillers. I think I'm going to add one more set of lines and we'll see what it looks like. And who would have thought that just by connecting dots you can get such interesting variations for those areas of your quilt? Now it's time to finish your quilt. If you have the same challenge quilt that I do, quilt the fabric in the middle of the quilt, filling in those chevrons with some variations. If you didn't get a challenge quilt or you don't have this fabric, don't worry. You can mark out chevrons on your fabric and quilt it just the same way. This is your time to play and come up with as many fun ways to quilt it as you want. Then once you're done, it's time to finish your beautiful quilt. Fill in the space between your blocks with the filler of your choice. I opted to fill in some of the space with swirls because I love the curviness of it, and let's just be honest, I was getting pretty tired of straight line quilting. In between the bigger drawn blocks and the ends of the quilt, I quilted wishbones. It gives me the same kind of effect as the swirls. Nice and curvy and round, but it really fits in those irregular shapes. It really doesn't matter what you quilt in that area, just as long as you finish the whole quilt. Once it's filled in, you can bind it and enjoy your beautiful dot-to-dot challenge quilt.